My best friend's chimpanzee ravaged my hands, nose, lips, and eyelids, making me look like this today. My name is Charla Nash. I am a 69-year-old American woman, and I was 55 when I went to visit my friend Sandra Harold, owner of a pet chimpanzee named Travis. At that time, I didn't know that my life was going to take a horrible turn. What started as a friendly encounter between Travis the chimpanzee and I quickly turned into a nightmare when, unpredictably, Travis brutally ripped off my face and hands. The arrival of the police transformed the once cheerful atmosphere of the house into a tense scene of reflection and regret for Sarah Harold. Travis, once considered a beloved family member, was now considered a threat and was directly killed by the police for everyone's safety. After the attack, I had a face transplant, but no hand transplant was done at that time. My life was profoundly affected by this incident, and I faced considerable challenges in my recovery. I struggled to regain some quality of life despite the physical and emotional after-effects of the attack. No justice has been served against Travis's owner or against the state of Connecticut, who authorized the possession of wild animals, and against whom I filed suit in 2011.
An employee at this funeral home in Florida was caught doing the imaginable. And when he was caught, he took his own life. So this news story made massive headlines when it happened earlier in 2023, but this is the Oak Lawn Funeral Home in Florida. And on one particularly gruesome evening, somebody who was working here in the funeral home was just walking around the building, doing inspections, cleaning up. And that's when they walked into one of the rooms and witnessed with their own eyes their coworker essaying a dead body. So names have never been officially released in this case, but this coworker immediately fled the scene. They made a police report, and shortly afterwards, deputies showed up at the Oak Lawn Funeral Home. But when the authorities arrived, the suspect had already fled the scene. So an APB was put out for this guy, and eventually they located his car. But when authorities approached the suspect's vehicle, they found that he had already taken his own life with a handgun. So obviously the funeral home sent out a mass email and tons of messages telling people that they don't know exactly what happened. They want to assure people that their relatives were fine and safe. But it really does make you question. This was just when this guy got caught. So how many times in the past had he already done this? And although the suspect's name was never released publicly, it was released to a number of people. And there was a massive petition started online to keep the suspect, who was a veteran, out of a veteran's cemetery. This is just a truly disturbing story, and it makes you question what exactly goes on behind funeral home doors when nobody's looking.
This is 100% the most unsettling and eerie video you will ever watch. This is the most realistically colored and stabilized version of Jack Tolosio's extremely eerie footage taken near the base of the South Tower in the Austin J. Tobin Plaza, while a version of Billy Joel's She's Always a Woman plays on. There's something about this video that's extremely unsettling, and you'll pick up on it right away.
I took the life of my pregnant friend and forcibly extracted her baby from her womb to pass it off as my own. I'm Taylor Parker, and this is the chilling account of my story. In 2020, in Texas, the fear of losing my partner motivated me to devise a sinister plan. Due to a previous hysterectomy that left me unable to have children, I was willing to do anything to keep him by my side. I deceived my partner into believing I was pregnant. maintaining this charade for months. I even organized a gender reveal party for our supposed child and proudly announced our due date on social media. On October 9th, the day before my fake delivery, I visited my friend Regan Simmons, who was expecting her second child. We had connected in a group for expectant mothers, and she was delighted that our due dates were so close. Unaware of my sinister intentions, she warmly welcomed me. I took advantage of her hospitality to commit the unimaginable. I attacked Regan with a hammer concealed in my bag, then pulled out a knife to stab her. However, I didn't stop there. Using a scalpel, I opened her abdomen and extracted her baby, preparing for this moment by watching instructional videos online. However, what I did next is even more horrifying.
This teenager from Leeds was a victim of a murder that shocked the UK. It was the 9th of July 1991. Julie Dart was 18 years old and didn't have a lot of money, so she began working as an S-worker in a red light area in Leeds. A man named Michael Sams drove to the area from his home in Newark in Nottinghamshire. Michael was a 50-year-old divorcee who had a hideous plan for Julie when he pulled up by the side of her that evening. After she got into his car, terrifyingly, he began to choke her. He blindfolded her and drove her to his warehouse. She had no idea where she was, and terrifyingly, she was about to be forced into a makeshift coffin. He also forced her to write a ransom note demanding money for her safe return. He then left her in the coffin, and this gave her an opportunity. While he was away, she was fighting for her life, trying to escape, and did actually manage to do so. She didn't actually realise that Michael had an alarm system, so as soon as she was free, he raced back to the scene and recaptured her again. She begged Michael for her life, but he killed her. Now pretending that she was still alive, Michael continued with the ransom requests. He was demanding money from authorities, but never actually received any. It seemed like he was just doing this all for his own fun, just to confuse police. Less than 2 weeks after she was killed, Julie's body was discovered in a field in eastern Lincolnshire. Police were stumped and had no idea who the mystery killer was. That was until he would take another victim in 1992. It was in kidnapping estate agent Stephanie Slater that he would finally slip up and be brought to justice. I've already posted the incredible survival story of Stephanie Slater just before this video. Michael was eventually imprisoned for his crimes and remains in prison to this day.
7-year-old Malachi was killed after being hit by a taxi while he was walking the streets of Bradford alone in the dark. So why was this 7-year-old boy alone, in the dark, on the streets of Bradford? Malachi's mother, Wendy Hall, who was 33, had left him in that house by himself while she went to visit her boyfriend for the night. It was a house that they'd previously lived in, so Malachi was familiar with it. They'd recently moved out to go and stay with Wendy's sister, but had gone back to pick up some belongings. Wendy intended to take Malachi to stay with her boyfriend for the night, but Malachi changed his mind and said he wanted to stay there. Instead of staying there with him or refusing to let him stay in a cold house and taking him back to her sister's, she left him in that house alone at 10 o'clock at night with no gas and no electric, and she went to stay at her boyfriend's house. She left him her phone so he could play on games while she was away. She locked the door behind her, but Malachi shortly after that got up, unlocked the deadbolt and went to find his mum. He was walking the streets of Bradford in the dark when he was hit by a taxi. He died at the scene and police found Wendy's mobile phone in his pocket. They managed to trace Wendy to her boyfriend's house to let her know that her son had died, and she had to go to the hospital to identify his body. The only defence that she had for the police was that she didn't think Malachi could unlock the door. She gave no excuses for why she left him there by himself. Prosecutors said that this was a deliberate disregard for the welfare of Malachi, a deliberate decision to leave him in that house with no gas or electric. She pleaded guilty to neglect, and on the 13th of April 2023, she was sentenced to just 5 years in prison. She will have to live with the fact that that decision that night led to the death of her son.
Killed my mother, cut off her head, and used it to give me a treat. I also killed 10 other people just for fun. My name is Ed Kemper, and I was born on December 18, 1948 in California. But I'm also known as the Santa Cruz Ogre or the Co-Ed Killer. I was raised alone by my mother after my parents divorced, but my mother often mistreated and humiliated me. making me sleep in the cellar of our house, for example. When I was younger, I used to kill cats just to let off steam, and I had some very strange fantasies. At the age of 15, I killed my grandparents to see what it felt like to kill, and because my grandmother beat me, I killed my grandfather out of pity for him so he wouldn't have to live without his wife. And I was committed to a maximum security psychiatric hospital for criminal minors. At the age of 21, I was released into my mother's care. After my release, my impulses intensified. I began to kill several students who were hitchhiking to train me, before moving on to my mother. It was on April 21st, 1973, that I decided to kill my mother in her sleep with a hammer to the skull, using her head to do horrible things with. And then I decided to kill Sally Hallett, her best friend. Then I got on the road and drove, and called the police to turn myself in and confess to everything I'd done, considering I'd achieved my goal. So I was sentenced to life imprisonment, and today I'm 74.
What do you think of me making YouTube videos? Well, I guess I don't mind. Takes up a lot of time.
This is Samantha Wolford, a former YouTuber, a woman who claimed to be a victim of a crime but ended up being a murderer herself. So on February 20th, 2015, Samantha called her mother and then the police in a state of distress. Apparently, Samantha had been bound and gagged by intruders and her husband had been abducted. At the time that this happened, Samantha had 5 children, and she had 3 of these children with her current husband. This is Ernie Ibarra, Samantha's husband. His body was discovered in the woods. He had been shot in the head. Now, when Samantha was originally questioned by police, like I said before, she said that her husband had been abducted, she had been beaten and bound and gagged. And she was asked by investigators why she decided to call her mother first and not 911. She stated that she was bound and gagged and she couldn't access her phone, so she used her face to dial her mother's phone number. The detectives asked her, well, how did you actually call your mom on your phone, which was locked, using only your face? Samantha stated that this was the first number that came up, and that's why she called her mom, but the detectives weren't buying it. And as they dug deeper into the story, they revealed a number of inconsistencies. It seemed that Samantha's open mouth led her into a world of trouble. Now, Samantha had always told her friends and family that she dreamed of becoming famous one day, and this would definitely make her famous, although in a terrible way. As it turned out, Samantha was actually the ringleader of a murder plot against her husband. Apparently, just a few days before all this happened, Samantha had met this man, Jonathan Kyle Sanford, at a local hospital. And after Samantha had told Jonathan that her husband was abusive, Jonathan offered to help take him out of the picture. He talked to 2 friends of his that were down to get in on this plot. And originally, the 4 people involved in this planned on just getting some methamphetamine, planting it on Samantha's husband, and framing him for a drug bust. But eventually, they decided that murder would simply be easier. Eventually, everybody involved in the plot was arrested, they were brought in, and they all received lengthy prison. But Samantha received the longest of all. She received a 99-year sentence with an additional 50 years for kidnapping. She tried to lie about murdering her own husband, got involved with all of this, and ended up paying the ultimate price.
The most brutal cartel in Mexico just released a new video, and I'm about to explain it. The video is 1 minute and 31 seconds long. The video is shot in portrait mode, making it kinda hard to make out what's happening. As you play the video, you see 3 men lying on the ground with their hands tied behind their backs, and they are surrounded by at least 5 heavily armed sicarios. The captives also have their shirts pulled over their heads so they can't see. The sicarios kick the men as they plead for their life. One of the captives then cries out, "We are asking you to forgive us. We will cooperate with you guys." A sicario then responds, "Shut the F up with that BS." The man then pleads again, "Seriously guys, we never even messed with you." Another sicario then says, "What do you want me cutting off first then?" Which is met by a response by another sicario saying, "Go ahead and remove someone's head already. Go ahead, go ahead." One of the captives then has his face pushed into the dirt and you hear him struggling for breath. One of the sicarios then gets a knife out and proceeds to stab the victim in the back of the neck, which results in the victim making noises of pain. The sicario then stops as he realizes it isn't effective. He then turns the victim over slightly and slits his throat. Blood forms on the ground as the victim makes horrible crying and screaming noises, which is just haunting. He continues having his throat cut as the other victims wait their turn. Another sicario then asks for a knife and slits the second victim's throat. He then pushes him back so he's lying on the first victim who is bleeding out. Blood soaks his white shirt as blood pours out of his neck. The sicario then decides to inflict more pain on the victim before he bleeds out, and it looks like he takes his knife and quickly pokes it into one of the victim's eyes. And you actually hear a popping type sound. The second victim doesn't make as much noise as the first, but you still hear the sounds of blood leaking. The third victim is lying on the ground in a fetal position attempting to protect himself. However, his head is pulled up exposing his neck, and a sicario then gets a knife and slices it into his throat. The knife is razor sharp and it cuts through the flesh and windpipe extremely quickly until it reaches the victim's spinal cord, which is when the sicario stops so that the victim can bleed out. And that is where the video concludes. This video is extremely brutal like all cartel videos, and the screams and cries of the first victim is extremely haunting and nightmare-inducing. Don't go looking for this video for obvious reasons, and you should definitely stay curious on this video. And hopefully this explanation was enough to make you less curious.
What? Nothing there, mate. Nothing there. What? There's nothing there.
What happened to this estate agent is like something off a horror film. It was the 22nd of January 1992. 25-year-old Stephanie Slater was working as an estate agent in Birmingham. On the day in question, she was doing a house viewing in Great Bar. She'd been asked to show a man called Bob around a house. During the appointment, however, she was attacked from behind. The man tied her up and blindfolded her, and during the terrifying ordeal, he gagged her and tied a rope around her neck. He dragged her down the stairs and forced her into his vehicle. He drove Stephanie to Newark and on the journey forced her to record a ransom message. Then he called the estate agents that Stephanie worked for and spoke to a man called Kevin Watts. He demanded a ransom sum and said that if he didn't pay, he was going to kill Stephanie. Kevin immediately alerted authorities and they raced to the address that Stephanie had been showing Bob round. They found blood at the scene and clumps of hair, but no sign of Stephanie. Meanwhile, the man took Stephanie into a warehouse where he AR'd her. However, the terrifying ordeal was far from over. He callously told Stephanie, "I hope you're not claustrophobic," before forcing her into a makeshift coffin with bricks on top. Not content with terrifying Stephanie into a hideously confined space, terrified for her life, he put bars up the legs of her trousers and told her they would give her electric shocks if she dared to move. He left her there overnight, and I can't imagine how terrifying that was. When he returned the next day, she was close to death. She was hypothermic, and he bizarrely took her out of the coffin and decided to make her a cup of tea. Once she'd warmed up a little bit, she tried to use the opportunity to make him feel a little bit guilty about keeping her prisoner by humanising herself. They started chatting and getting on quite well, but he immediately switched up. He would play this game where he put her in the coffin, kept her in there, took her out, had a chat with her, put her back in, and kept her captive for 8 days. Meanwhile, police were working on trying to get the ransom money to Bob in the hopes that he would release her. They followed his instructions to drop the money off and planned to follow him afterwards. However, the instructions that Bob left were simply to put the money in a bag and drive off. Kevin did this with the money, put it in the bag and left. After picking the money up, the kidnapper went back to the warehouse, and at this point he did something that nobody expected. He got Stephanie out of the coffin and said he was going to take her home, and he did just that. Her family were obviously absolutely overjoyed to have her back. In an effort to try and identify the kidnapper, Crime Watch broadcasted the small recording that they had of the kidnapper's voice. This was what they had collected from the phone calls that the kidnapper had made. Thankfully, this worked, and a woman rang up and stated that she knew that voice. It was her ex-husband. He was 51-year-old Michael Sams. Police arrested him without knowing that he was also responsible for a murder the year prior. Michael was given 4 life sentences for what he did to Stephanie, as well as for the killing of 18-year-old Julie Dart in 1991. I will be posting a video on Julie's case just after this one. Tragically, Stephanie passed away from cancer in 2017, but she did release a book about her ordeal called Beyond Fear, My Will to Survive. Michael remains in prison and is among the oldest and longest serving life prisoners in England and Wales. He was nicknamed the One-Legged Killer and was controversially awarded £4,000 in damages when the prison service lost his artificial leg during a transfer.
One time someone did dive headfirst into boiling water at Yellowstone after a dog. In 1981, David Kirwan was at Yellowstone with a friend when his friend's dog got away and jumped into a 200-degree hot spring. People around were screaming at David to not go in after the dog, but he didn't even give it a second thought. He just dove straight in. Some people completely dissolve when they do this because the pools tend to be very acidic, which I talk about in this week's episode, but that didn't happen here. So David was able to swim out far enough to get the dog, but he realized it was way too hot, so he had to leave the dog and turned around to come back. His friend was able to pull him out, but at this point David was completely blind from the boiling water getting into his eyes. A stranger had also run over to help, and he tried to take David's shoe off of his foot, but David's skin had completely melted and started coming off with the shoe. And on top of all of this tragedy, Moosey, the dog, unfortunately didn't make it out of the hot spring. She was completely lost. And David also succumbed to the burns the next day. You'd assume at this point people know the dangers of the hot springs, but people go into them way more often than you'd think. If you have a dark curiosity about this kind of stuff, you might be interested in the episode I just did.
How young is the world's youngest serial killer? 20? 18? Even 15? This age reveal at the end of the story will shock you. Amarjit Sadeh killed 3 people in separate incidences between 2006 and 2007. I spent a weekend with one of the most notorious killers in Texas. So in my early 20s, I spent a lot of time in South Texas in women's prisons units, helping people find forgiveness and second chances at life. And on this one particular weekend, when we arrived, the correctional officers informed our team that there was a new inmate on the premises. She was only 17 years old and had been tried and convicted as an adult for a very violent crime. And because I was the youngest person on our prison team, they voted me to be the one to work with her because she was young, I was young, and she might relate to me and open up to me. Now, I had a rule for myself when I worked with these women to never look up their crimes. I didn't want it to affect my judgment about them or to affect my willingness to help them, so that was just a rule that I always kept. So the correctional officers, they walked me down this long corridor into a classroom where sitting at the table was Erin Caffey. Now, Erin Caffey is a tiny thing. Now, I'm a tiny person, and I dwarfed her. She's very small, very timid, very soft-spoken, rarely will look you in the eye. And my first thought whenever I lay eyes on her and I sit down across from her is, how can somebody this small and this timid possibly be convicted as an adult for a violent crime? What violence is she possibly capable of? Little did I know. We started talking and we kind of started to get to know each other a little bit, cracked a few jokes. I tried to get her to lighten up. And eventually she did start kind of opening up to me, and she started volunteering some details about her version of what had happened the night of her crime. And I have to admit, even though I had a rule to really try not to know what people had done, I was very curious because, again, here's this tiny little thing. She's 17 years old, looks scared to death, and she's in this facility. And well, her version of the events that took place the night of the crime led me to believe that she was a victim in all of it and that it was really out of her hands. She couldn't stop it, and she's haunted by it, regrets it every day of her life, and she just wishes she could take it all back. And y'all, she was so convincing, just absolutely convincing, that I truly believed that she was innocent. She had somehow gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd, was wrongly convicted. And I started brainstorming in my head, like, how can I raise awareness about this and help her get out? Little did I know, in my naivety, that this young lady was a psychopath. She was very cunning, very manipulative, and the small, mousy, timid, soft-spoken thing was very much a calculated tactic to be a wolf in sheep's clothing. And my time with her started a long season of my life of panic attacks and nightmares, and I'm going to tell you more about that in part 2. The story of this American female serial killer will make your hair stand up. As if her crimes are not horrific enough, she earned the nickname the Giggling Granny. How creepy is that? Nanny Doss was raised on a farm by a very controlling father, and one of the few joys that she had in life was sneaking into her mother's room and reading her romance novels, and she would daydream about the day that she'd be swept off her feet and have her happily ever after. And she got married to her first husband at the age of 16, and it was a miserable marriage. The couple had 4 daughters together, 2 of which mysteriously died of food poisoning, at which point the husband took one remaining daughter and fled because he was scared to death of Nanny. The remaining infant baby named Florine was left with Nanny, and Nanny picked up and married somebody new. Now this man was an alcoholic, but despite that, they were married 16 years and raised Florine together. This is where the bloodbath really begins. Nanny was in the room right after her daughter Melvina had given birth to her second grandchild, and while Melvina was still loopy from the labor drugs and she was exhausted, she could have sworn that she saw Nanny stick a hat pin in the baby's head. Melvina kind of passed out and went back to sleep, but when she came to, she started asking her family members, did Nanny have a hat pin and stick the baby in the head? And the family regretted to inform Melvina that the baby had in fact died, and yes, they did see Nanny holding a hat pin. However, the doctors couldn't give a positive explanation for the baby's death. The death of the baby absolutely shattered Melvina and her husband, and they started fighting and drifting apart, and Melvina started dating a soldier named Robert, who Nanny did not approve of. And one night when Melvina was out of the house and Robert was left alone with Nanny, Robert mysteriously died, and Nanny received $500 in life insurance that she had taken out on Robert a couple weeks earlier. Not long after that, Nanny's husband forced himself on her, and she didn't like that, so she put rat poison in his corn whiskey jar, and he died that night. Nanny married her third husband only 3 days after meeting him, and he died shortly after this of heart failure. She picked up some life insurance, bought some land, and built a new house. Her late third husband left behind a mother and a bedridden sister who also died shortly after. At this point, Nanny burned the house down, took that life insurance money, and moved on. Then Nanny landed a fourth husband, and at this point her mom moved in with him. She found out that her husband was cheating, so she poisoned him to death, and for good measure, she poisoned her mom to death too. Then she married her a fifth man named Samuel Doss, who was very disapproving of the romance novels that she loved to read. He went to the hospital one night with flu-like symptoms and was diagnosed with a severe digestive tract infection. He was treated and sent home. And a few days later, he showed up dead. The doctors were very suspicious of this, so they did an autopsy and found enough arsenic in his system to kill 20 men. Nanny was arrested shortly after this and confessed to killing 4 of her husbands, her mother-in-law, her mother, her sister-in-law, and yes, sadly, even the baby with the hat pin.